5:48 p.m., a dusty sniper range at a remote army base in Nevada. The desert heat waves shimmer off the sand, distorting the horizon like a fever dream. A tactical exercise is grinding to a halt because a simulated high-value target has appeared at extreme range, well beyond the standard carbine's reach. The instructor, a scarred master sergeant, bellows across the line. "Any snipers here? Anyone who can actually touch that steel?" A few soldiers look away, checking their dusty boots. In the back of the line, Specialist Hannah Brooks, a quiet, unassuming observer, steps forward. She's carrying a long-range bolt-action rifle. The entire team watches in silence. Nevada's high desert is an unforgiving classroom, a place where the sun is a physical weight and the sand finds its way into every crevice of a soldier's gear. The wind here doesn't just blow, it dances, shifting directions with a chaotic rhythm that can deceive even the most experienced eyes. In this environment, long-distance shooting isn't just a skill, it's a brutal combination of high-level mathematics, biological control, and pure intuition. Specialist Hannah Brooks had been attached to this unit for nearly 3 months, but to the majority of the men in the platoon, she was still essentially a ghost. She was the one who stood in the far back during the morning briefings, her face partially obscured by the brim of her patrol cap. She was the one who didn't join in the loud, ego-driven stories of near misses at the mess hall. She was the one who spent her evenings in the corner of the armory, meticulously cleaning her optics with a degree of precision that bordered on religious obsession. The platoon was comprised of battle-hardened infantrymen, many of whom carried the scars and the cynicism of multiple deployments to the Middle East. To them, Hannah was just a new girl or a filler attached to the support element. They saw her small, lean frame and her reserved nature and immediately made a series of assumptions. They assumed she lacked the grit required for the real work of the infantry. They assumed that because she didn't shout or assert her dominance, she didn't have anything worth saying. Because she didn't brag about her groupings or her kill shots during basic qualification, they assumed she couldn't hit a target at 500 yards, let alone the extreme distances required for precision work. "She's probably just here to check the boxes for the observer qualification," Specialist Miller had whispered earlier that morning, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Hannah adjust the tension on her rifle's bipod. Miller was a loud, confident soldier who measured competence by the volume of one's voice. "I'd be surprised if she's ever felt the actual kick of a .300 Win Mag. Long-range work isn't for the faint of heart, Brooks. Why don't you stick to keeping the spotting binoculars clean for the real shooters? We wouldn't want you to bruise your shoulder on the big boy gear." Hannah didn't react. She didn't offer a witty comeback, and she didn't look up from her rifle. She never did. She had learned very early in her military career that words were the cheapest currency on a base, while performance was the most expensive. She knew that the loudest person in the room is almost always the one trying to drown out their own insecurities. She was perfectly content to be a shadow in the unit, a quiet professional who understood that her true value wasn't defined by the shifting opinions of men who didn't know her history or her capabilities. The afternoon exercise had been a grueling test of endurance and skill. The objective was complex: identify, range, and neutralize a series of targets hidden among the rocky outcrops, with distances stretching from a standard 300 yards all the way to a staggering 1,200 yards. One by one, the experienced shooters in the platoon had stepped up to the line. They were focused, aggressive, and confident. But the desert was winning today. The wind was gusting at 15 knots, swirling violently between the draws. Dust plumes were kicking up, obscuring the sightlines. Shots were falling short or drifting wildly into the rocks. The steel targets remained stubbornly silent. The frustration on the range was a physical thing, thick and heavy. Master Sergeant Henderson, a man whose face looked like it was carved from the very Nevada limestone they stood upon, was losing his patience. He didn't want bravado, he wanted results. He wanted a shooter who could read the invisible currents of the air, not someone who just knew how to pull a trigger and pray for a hit. "We're burning daylight, we're burning ammunition, and we're burning my patience," Henderson roared, his voice cutting through the wind like a siren. His face was a deep shade of crimson as he looked at the line of failed shooters. I need a marksman who understands how to account for a swirling crosswind. Is there anyone in this entire platoon who knows how to hold for a gust? Any snipers? Anyone who isn't just playing dress-up today? The line of soldiers went deathly quiet. Miller, who had been so vocal during the morning hike, looked down at his boots and remained silent. The target was a small steel silhouette tucked into a crevice at 1,100 yards, a distance so vast that even the rotation of the earth and the temperature of the air began to skew the bullet's path. That was the moment Hannah Brooks stepped out of the shadows. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't make a grand announcement. She simply adjusted the strap of her heavy rifle and walked toward the firing line with a steady, rhythmic gait. Her movements were fluid and economical, entirely devoid of the nervous, frantic energy that was vibrating through the rest of the team. As she reached the line, the other soldiers began to murmur, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and suppressed amusement. "Brooks?" Henderson asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched the quiet specialist drop her gear. "You actually want a crack at the long-range steel? This isn't a qualifying round for a ribbon specialist. This is about as real as it gets on a range." Hannah offered a short, disciplined nod, her eyes already scanning the horizon. "Yes, Master Sergeant. I'm qualified on the system, and I've been tracking the wind since 1400 hours." A few of the soldiers in the back laughed. Miller shook his head, leaning over to a fellow infantryman. "This is going to be a comedy. She's going to miss by 50 yards and probably get knocked over by the recoil. I hope someone's recording this." Hannah ignored the noise. She lay down in the prone position, her body aligning perfectly with the axis of the rifle. She wasn't just lying on the ground, she was sinking into it, becoming a permanent part of the landscape. She was the quiet professional, and for the first time that day, the desert seemed to go quiet, as if it were finally ready to listen to someone who actually understood its language. If you think quiet professionals are often underestimated, type unfair. The target was a ghost, a tiny, non-reflective black speck lost against the beige and rust-colored expanse of the Nevada foothills. To the untrained eye, it was invisible. To Hannah, it was the only thing in the world. She didn't immediately reach for the bolt or peer into the scope. Instead, she stayed perfectly still for nearly 60 seconds. She was observing. She wasn't looking at the target. She was looking at the scrub brush. She was watching the way the dust kicked up in a dry wash 500 yards downrange. She was feeling the subtle pressure of the wind on the back of her neck, timing the intervals between the heavy gusts. "You need a spotter, Brooks?" Henderson asked, his voice noticeably softer now. He was a veteran, and he recognized the look in her eyes, the cold, detached focus of a hunter. He was curious to see if she was the real deal or just a desperate volunteer. "Specialist Lane," Hannah said, her voice clear, calm, and utterly devoid of tremor. "If he's willing to provide the data." Lane, a quiet, observant soldier who often worked alongside Hannah in the support element, stepped up without a word. He dropped into the dirt beside her, unfolding a tripod for a high-powered spotting scope. They didn't engage in the usual masculine bravado or check-me-out talk. They spoke in the clipped, efficient shorthand of specialists who had practiced this dance in the dark. "Distance is confirmed at 1,122 yards, Lane muttered, his eye pressed firmly to the glass. "Wind is coming from the 9 o'clock, gusting 12 to 15 knots. But watch the draw at the 800-yard mark. It's creating a localized vortex, pulling everything to the right." "Copy," Hannah replied. Her fingers moved to the tactical turrets on her scope with the muscle memory of a master. She wasn't guessing or eyeballing the shot. She was making precise mechanical adjustments based on the density altitude, the temperature, and the specific ballistic coefficient of her match-grade rounds. She was building a mathematical bridge across the desert. Behind her, the murmuring intensified. The soldiers were getting restless. "What is she waiting for?" Someone hissed from the line. "It's been 3 minutes. Just take the shot so we can go to dinner." "She's frozen," Miller whispered loudly, his confidence returning. "The distance got to her. It's one thing to clean a rifle. It's another thing to handle the pressure of the master sergeant watching you fail." But Hannah wasn't frozen. She was calculating. In the world of extreme long-range marksmanship, A single poorly timed heartbeat can move the point of impact by 6 inches at 1,000 yards. She was waiting for the lull, that fleeting 3-second window where the wind stabilizes just enough to provide a predictable flight path. She was breathing in a slow, rhythmic pattern, consciously lowering her heart rate until it was a steady, rhythmic thrum in her chest. She checked her anti-cant level. The rifle was perfectly upright. She felt the cold steel of the trigger, her finger resting on it with the lightness of a butterfly's wing. She was no longer a person, she was a platform. Wind is dropping, holding at 8 knots. Now, Lane whispered. Hannah didn't hesitate. She didn't jerk the trigger or anticipate the blast. She squeezed it with a slow, constant rearward pressure that ensured the shot surprised even her. Crack. The heavy rifle recoiled straight back into her shoulder, a sharp, violent punch that she absorbed without flinching. A small cloud of dust erupted from the muzzle brake. For a long, agonizing second, the entire range was silent. The bullet was traveling through the air at over 2,000 feet per second, fighting gravity, fighting the swirling Nevada wind. A tiny piece of lead on a lonely mission across the sand. Impact, Lane said, his voice brimming with a rare, suppressed excitement. High right, on the shoulder of the steel. You touched it, Brooks. 1,100 yards, and you touched it on the first cold-bore shot. A collective gasp went up from the platoon. They had seen the experts miss all day long, hitting nothing but sand and rock. The quiet girl had just touched steel on her very first attempt. But Hannah wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. She was already working the bolt, the spent brass casing spinning out of the chamber and landing in the sand with a soft metallic tink. Adjusting 2 clicks left, she whispered to Lane. The draw at 800 is pulling harder than the chart suggested. Elevation is good. Holding for the next lull. Copy. Wind is picking up again. 14 knots. 16 knots. Hold. Hold. She waited again. Another 2 minutes of absolute, terrifying stillness. The soldiers who had been mocking her were now leaning forward, their eyes wide, their mouths shut. They realized that her slowness wasn't a lack of confidence. It was the ultimate form of discipline. She wasn't shooting to finish the exercise. She was shooting to succeed. She was playing a game of chess with the atmosphere. She fired a second time. Clang! The sound of lead hitting steel echoed across the flat desert floor, a sharp, unmistakable metallic ring that silenced every doubt on the range. Center mass, Lane reported, his voice steady now. Right in the heart of the silhouette. You found the center, Hannah. Hannah still didn't stand up. She didn't look back for approval, and she didn't look at Miller. She stayed behind the rifle, her eyes still fixed on the glass, scanning for the next target in the sequence. She had proven, without saying a single word, that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't the loudest one. It's the one that has the patience to wait for the light. If you realize patience is part of real skill, type, I was wrong. Master Sergeant Henderson walked over to the firing line, his heavy boots crunching on the spent brass casings like gravel. He stood over Hannah for a moment, looking down at her perfectly still form, then looked out at the distant steel target that was still vibrating from the impact. He had seen thousands of soldiers pass through his ranges over 2 decades of service, but he knew true excellence when he saw it. This wasn't a lucky shot. This was the result of 1,000 hours of unseen, unglamorous labor. Stand up, specialist, Henderson said, his voice carrying a new tone, one that the platoon hadn't heard before. It was the tone of genuine, hard-earned respect. Hannah stood up, brushing the Nevada dust from her uniform. Her face remained neutral, her rifle held at a perfect, low-ready position. She didn't look like she had just done something extraordinary. She looked like she had just finished a routine paperwork task. Where in the hell did you learn to read a draw like that? Henderson asked, his eyes searching hers. I've got guys with 3 combat tours who can't calculate a swirling wind in this desert without a ballistic computer. You did it with your naked eyes and a feeling. The entire platoon had gathered around the firing point now, the air thick with an intense, awkward curiosity. Miller was standing at the very front of the circle, his face pale, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been making fun of a tiger because it was sleeping. "I was a designated marksman trainer at my last post in Fort Benning, sir," Hannah replied quietly, her voice barely rising above the wind. "And before I enlisted, I spent 4 years as a competitive long-range shooter in the mountains of Montana. My father was a scout sniper in the Marines during the Gulf War. He taught me that if you can't hear the wind speaking to you, you have no business being behind the glass." The silence that followed her statement was heavy. The new girl wasn't just a support soldier or an observer. She was a highly qualified markswoman who had probably spent more time on a range than half the platoon combined. She hadn't mentioned it because she didn't feel the need to justify her presence. She didn't need the validation of a mess hall story. She knew exactly what she was capable of, and she was simply waiting for the mission to require her skills. "A trainer?" Miller stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Brooks, why in the world didn't you say anything when we were talking about the qualification standards this morning? We all thought you were, you know, new to the system." Hannah looked at Miller, her gaze steady, cold, but not entirely unkind. "You didn't ask about my qualifications, specialist. You asked if I wanted to handle the big boy gear. I figured it was much more efficient to show you than to spend 30 minutes arguing about it." Henderson let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like sandpaper. "She's got you there, Miller. While you were busy talking about how great you are, she was busy doing the math in her head. That's the fundamental difference between a trigger puller and a marksman. A marksman understands that 80% of the work happens before the finger even touches the trigger. The shot is just the conclusion of the argument." The master sergeant turned back to the rest of the platoon, his expression hardening. "Listen up. What you just saw wasn't a miracle shot. It was a master class in the concept of the quiet professional. Specialist Brooks didn't step up because she wanted to show off her skills or get a pat on the back. She stepped up because the mission required a specific capability, and she was the only one on this line who had it. She didn't rush. She didn't let your chatter or your mockery get inside her head. She stayed calm, she observed the environment, and she executed with precision." He looked back at Hannah, a small nod of approval. "Brooks, starting tomorrow morning at 0500, I want you assisting with the long-range instruction for the rest of the unit. We have far too many people in this platoon who think shooting is about volume of fire and looking tough. I want them to learn about precision. I want them to learn about the physics of the air. And most importantly, I want them to learn how to wait for the shot." "Yes, Master Sergeant," Hannah said, offering a crisp, perfect salute. As the platoon began to pack up their gear for the day, the atmosphere on the range had shifted entirely. The sneers and the whispers were gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative respect. The men who had previously ignored Hannah or treated her like a nuisance were now approaching her, tentatively asking questions about her wind reading techniques and how she adjusted her scope for the Nevada heat. They realized that they had nearly dismissed the most valuable asset in their unit simply because she didn't fit their preconceived Hollywood image of a warrior. Justice on the range isn't about receiving a medal or a certificate. It's about the silent recognition of competence. And for Hannah Brooks, the sharp clanging of that distant steel was the only testimony she ever needed. She had proven that in the world of the calm mind, silence is the greatest strength. She was no longer a ghost. She was the standard. If you believe discipline and patience deserve respect, type, "I owe you." The following weeks at the Nevada base were a fascinating study in organizational change. Hannah Brooks was no longer the shadow in the back of the line. She was the anchor of the platoon's precision element. But despite her new role as an instructor and the sudden influx of attention, she didn't change her personality. She didn't become loud, demanding, or arrogant. She remained the same quiet, focused professional she had always been. The only difference was that now, when she spoke, every man in the room stopped breathing so they wouldn't miss a syllable. During the morning training sessions, the soldiers noticed a distinct difference in Hannah's teaching style. She didn't teach by shouting or by shaming those who missed. She taught by observing. She would walk slowly behind a shooter, watching their breathing patterns, the way their finger interacted with the trigger, and the subtle tension in their shoulders. Then she would lean in and whisper a single, transformative piece of advice. "You're anticipating the recoil, Miller," she told him during a particularly difficult session involving a 1,000-yard mover. "You're fighting the rifle before it even fires. You're trying to control the explosion. Don't. Close your eyes for a second. Breathe with the desert. Let the rifle surprise you when it breaks." Miller followed her advice, setting aside his ego for the first time in his career. He began to hit targets at ranges he previously thought were physically impossible. He realized that Hannah's true strength wasn't just in her eyes or her steady hands. It was in her temperament. She had a way of bringing the entire room down to her level of absolute calm. She made the chaos of a high-wind range feel like a predictable equation. "I used to think being a soldier was about being the loudest, toughest guy in the room," Miller confessed to her one evening as they were cleaning their rifles in the armory. "I thought if you weren't constantly proving how much space you could take up, you were weak. I was wrong. Watching you on that range, it changed how I look at everything. It changed how I look at myself." Hannah paused, her cleaning cloth running over the bolt of her rifle with rhythmic precision. She looked at Miller, her expression soft but firm. "Respect shouldn't come from what you say you can do, Miller. It should come from the results you deliver when the world is actually falling apart and the noise is deafening. The noise is just a distraction. In the field, the noise is what gets you found. The silence is what keeps you alive." The story of the quiet marksman spread through the base like wildfire. It became a foundational lesson for the new recruits. Never judge the capability of a soldier by their volume or their frame. The instructors began to use Hannah as the primary example of the calm hero, the person who doesn't need a spotlight or a microphone to perform at an elite level. At the very end of the training cycle, the unit held a final evaluation, a Top Gun-style competition. The targets were even more difficult, the wind even more chaotic, and the time limits were razor-thin. But this time, the platoon didn't look frustrated or panicked. They looked like Hannah. They were still. They were observant. They were calculating. The master sergeant watched from the tower as the steel targets rang out one after another, a rhythmic symphony of precision. He turned to Hannah, who was standing by his side, her binoculars raised as she monitored the wind for her students. "You didn't just teach them how to shoot a rifle, Brooks," Henderson said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "You taught them how to think. You taught them how to be professionals. You gave them the one thing they couldn't buy with a training manual, the discipline of the mind." Hannah lowered her binoculars and offered a small, rare smile, the first one Miller had ever seen. "They always had the skill, Master Sergeant. They just needed to stop talking long enough to find it. If you believe respect should come from actions, type, 'I will live with honor.' In our modern world, we are conditioned to believe that the person who speaks the loudest is the one in charge. We are told from a young age that charisma is the same thing as competence, and that visibility is the only true measure of value. We judge the people around us by their first impressions, their social media status, and their ability to command attention in a crowded room. We often ignore the quiet ones in the corner, assuming they are simply along for the ride. But the story of Specialist Hannah Brooks is a powerful, enduring reminder that true greatness is often found in the quietest corners of the room. True competence doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to advertise its existence or demand a seat at the table. It is built in the thousands of hours of unseen practice, in the quiet dedication to a craft that no one else is watching, and in the iron discipline to remain calm when the rest of the world is screaming for action. It is the strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing anyone else to tell you. In the military, they have a term of the highest honor, the quiet professional. It describes a person who does the hardest jobs, solves the